Welcome, everyone, to another podcast of the Center for Asian American Christianity. It's my delight and pleasure to introduce a new colleague, Rachel Robertson, who is Assistant Professor of the Academy of Chinese History, Philosophy, and Religion at Hong Kong Baptist University, where I presented a paper this past August. And over the conference panel that we were on and through coffee conversations and meal conversations, I got to know Professor Robertson's work and thought she would be a wonderful guest to speak to on our podcast. So, Rachel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
Perhaps you can share a little bit more of your background for our audience and perhaps some of our shared interests, especially when it comes to digital technology and Asian American family life.
Sure, yeah. So my background's in philosophy. I've always been interested in the impact of traits and habits, or maybe what we could call virtues or character, on how we act and relate to each other in the world around us. And I'm sure we all know, especially in the last few years, technology is just an important and interesting context to think about these kinds of things. So how who we are impacts on our use of technology, and then also the other way around. As we use these different technologies, which are so part of our daily lives, how does it impact on us? How does it shape us? And at the moment, I'm actually working on a few projects to do with education, so secondary school and higher education, thinking about this virtue habit in the classroom. How does that work? How can we prepare young people in and also for the digital world? But I'm also a Christian and I'm in this department in Hong Kong, which is very special. It combines religion and philosophy together. So I'm very thankful I get to work alongside colleagues from religion. And also previously in my previous projects, I'm always interested in drawing on resources from theology. And so when I talk about virtue, habit, use of technology, I've always got one eye, or maybe even more than one eye, on the church and what resources can be brought from the church to help in this situation, and then also maybe the other way around. So what kind of things can come from my research, what I'm seeing to help those of us in the church to really think about how we use technology.
Rachel and I have been chatting and discussing, and I've been making this historical analogy that as the printing press was a radical technological innovation in early modern Europe, without which the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther's ideas and the 95 Theses and pamphlets and printing the Bible in the vernacular would not have occurred. So digital technology is creating a similar type of rupture in how we create, distribute, consume content. And so that's one of the historical framings of our conversation is both at a research level, Rachel and I are interested in how digital technologies form or shape us as followers of Christ, especially within our Asian and Asian American context, and how this impacts church life, church ministry, family life, intergenerational family conversations. And before we hit record, we were commenting on this quotidian observation, the Asian family dinner table. You've got parents who've had a long day at work, haven't seen their family. They put a hot meal down, and there are kids coming to the table for a meal. And the kids have this rectangular looking metal device, like surgically attached their hand with their eyes glued to the screen, doing this kind of thing and that kind of thing, never leaving the presence of this phone. And the parents get annoyed, stressed. They have fights over whether there are phones allowed at the table. And so it's creating anxiety, digital technologies and the social media apps on these mini computers. And Asian families in general, even now, public school systems. In my son's New Jersey public school, we received an email this past summer, something to the effect that phones are not allowed in the classroom. And there would be like penalties attached. And the fact that they had to put this policy out there indicates a continuing evolution in how society, educational institutions, family structures deal with this radical revolution in how we create and consume content. So I just invite perhaps a little social commentary of our current zeitgeist, Rachel. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about how we feel like technology, especially, I think we're talking about quite recent forms with the smartphone, recent forms of social media, and then, of course, as everyone's talking, artificial intelligence, which is a big umbrella. It covers a lot of things. It could cover the algorithms that work under social media. It could include now the more recent AI chatbots and things that are becoming more common. All of these feel like they've really changed how people relate to each other, how people are accessing content, as you say, the dynamic in the classroom, at family, in the church, even, I suppose also thinking what's just happened over the past few years, things like the COVID pandemic, technology was also a really big theme of how we use it and how it suddenly became even more embedded, I think, into all of these contexts. So, yes, definitely change. But I think one thing that I've talked to you about is this maybe language of amplification, or there was something already there. And technology, in some ways, is a mirror. As philosopher of technology, Shannon Veller, she talks about the AI mirror. It reflects back biases, injustice, things of the past that were already there, but maybe even more than a mirror, a kind of amplifier of problems that are already there in society that due to socio-political changes recently, all of these get heightened when we add the current forms of technology into the mix. So that's the sort of language that I'm interested in, that there were problems already, and then when we add technology, especially for young people, I feel like things get heightened. There's ways that technology works that, yeah, just makes these things worse and also makes them feel worse as well. I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that emotional side too.
Amplification of pre-existing conditions. That's what I heard from you, Rachel. And I'm especially interested in how different generations of Asian families and Asian churches use technologies and how it may amplify some of the pre-existing conditions and stresses and strains therein. For this podcast, you and I wanted to focus on anxiety, especially as anxiety relates to digital technology use. So when we talk about anxiety in digital tech, what do you see as the particular ways technologies amplify our worries about work, education, and relationships? Do you have some examples in mind?
Yeah, I mean, as we've been saying, we kind of start with the usual worries and then we think, how does technology amplify them? So when I think about my students and the young people I see around me at church, we can think about work as a big one, concern about work, what jobs will be available, who will have jobs, and also the conditions under which we will work. Will they be pleasant, or will they be stressful? And I think it's clear that technology feeds into all of those worries. For example, that the concerns about replacement by AI. But even before we get to these more sophisticated models of AI, we could think about the way that there's software that tracks productivity or even is involved in the hiring process, and really changes the conditions for working and even getting a job in the first place, even before we talk about very sophisticated AI, which can take the job of a journalist or something like that, for example. Then, yeah, think about relationships. It's difficult to relate to people. Anyway, there are pressures of the world today, people moving away, especially here in Hong Kong, people moving away, migration, people moving back, different populations, lots of changes, I think, and a lot of different responses as well. And then when you put it into the context of technology, then maybe one of the words that usually comes up is something like polarization, where you get people moved to the opposite extreme on whatever topic, whatever group. And so all of those existing tensions get amplified as well. So the existing anxiety that anyone might have because of the different social, political events going on, once you add in the discourse on social media, the way that news is spread, things heighten again.
You mentioned how these technologies cut against the grain of what we assume or have taken formation to work. And then you mentioned this emotion of anxiety as emerging from not knowing how to adapt to this new formation process, which makes a lot of sense. So there's something new with digital technologies. What do you feel is different about AI and digital platforms compared to older technologies? What is really new here?
Maybe features of technology which go towards the formation of beliefs or values and actions. And one way to think about it is that technology, especially those which rely on artificial intelligence, which again can be quite broad from anything from the recommender algorithms on search engines to what underlies productivity software and handwriting recognition and so on. It just allows us to form our beliefs, values, and actions in new ways. Another way to think about it is in terms of autonomy. So by that, I don't mean like Terminator style artificial intelligence having its own free will. That could be a separate topic. That doesn't quite interest me that much. I'm more interested in how even while at the moment I don't think AI is sentient, it already in some ways acts on its own accord. We can give over our actions and decision making to technology, just like using AI for decision making in admissions for college or the justice system. It's already been used for sentencing and things like that. Think about self-driving cars, all of that. That is new. To be able to give over our actions and decision makings, or even like curating on what we see on our news feeds or which groups get recommended, we're able to give that over to technology. So yeah, in some ways, these networks are not new, but I think they're heightened, and then as more of us access these technologies, we're more enmeshed in them as well.
I want to drill down into something quite particular now and talk a little bit about intergenerational dynamics within Asian family and church life. What do you see happening among younger Asian Christians? Some say platforms like TikTok are shaping young people's lives and imaginations more than parents, pastors, or teachers. From your perspective, what does this mean for discipleship among younger Asian Christians?
I think it's right that TikTok, other platforms, and increasingly, I think AI conversational platforms as well. Those are the first port of call and also the last port of call from waking up to lying down. I feel like that is where young people go for answers, for ordering their routines. It's not just the frequency, I think it's also the concentration. Everything channeled through certain technology platforms offered by certain companies. So, and I think that's especially the trend with these artificial intelligence systems is to have everything centralized and for it to be very easy for you to do everything through one platform. And I think that's a trend here in Hong Kong as well. Everything they were quite, as I said, we're quite high tech. There's a lot of amazing platforms, a lot of our own tech companies from this area of the world, everything on one platform. So from buying to traveling to reading to social media, everything's on one. And I talked about port of call as well. I think there's also a level of trust as well. So you mentioned this replacement of teachers or pastors, and I think there's something called the technological halo effect, where especially with the pronouncements of AI, it's like a conversational system. It sounds very authoritative. People tend to trust it or believe what technology gives them, seen as more rational, more objective when you see it on a digital platform. And so I definitely think that there's this mentor-like role that I know, for example, young people who they'll come along to a youth group or Bible study, but they'll have generated the answers beforehand with AI just because they just want to know the answer. And so that's who they're talking to if they have a theological question or they want clarification. Generally about everything from fitness routines, especially when they're trying to understand the Bible or thinking through some big issue. They'll just ask. They'll just ask their choice of AI chatbot. And so there's this issue of trust as well. So there's this routine use, this erosion of the offline online, and then also a real trust, I think, and especially the going to AI regularly. And of course, with those platforms which have memory, it encourages you to treat it like an ongoing conversation as well. So in that way, it even more has this role of a mentor, teacher, or pastor, one that's available any hour of the day. So that's the lens through which you see the world, I think.
On the other side, for folks
Mm.
like myself I'm Gen X, what do you notice in the ways older generations use digital platforms such as Facebook or WhatsApp groups? I remember Facebook for my generation was the primary digital technology social media platform, but I'm not sure we used it so ritualistically, so port of call wise. Can you say a little bit more about differences in the way older generations use digital tech?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there might be more of a divide amongst older people compared to younger people. I feel like with young people it's very difficult to resist not using it at all. Whereas with older people, I think you get maybe two groups, at least from the people I know. Those who maybe have quite a heightened awareness of the issues, they didn't like Facebook, the earlier iterations of social media, and maybe just don't use it. Or, but I do think there's a group, and this is actually more represented in the people I know who are really highly online. It's just different. It's just different platforms that they use. So they wouldn't be on TikTok or they wouldn't be using the same platforms as young people, which itself brings its own issues because there's issues of awareness, of not being connected to what young people are talking about and what they're doing, perhaps widening gaps between generations. But yeah, I think for those that I know, WhatsApp, WeChat, these sort of messaging services are very popular and constant as well. So that's where even older people they're getting their news from, just from like the forwarded many times messages that those I get those from people older than me. I don't get them from younger than me, I have to say. And my students, I do a course on cyber world citizenship, and I talk to them. One thing I'm interested in is their perception of their parents' use of technology as well, and teachers' use of technology, and students are often well, first of all, they're often quite jaded about the idea of technological ethics because they're kind of like, we know the risks, we know them very well. And then they say it's the older people who don't know the risks. It's my great uncle who keeps sending me misinformation, or they just forward anything that they see, or they're clicking on scams all the time, or they're the ones glued to their phones, or they take photos of me and share them without my permission. Or their teachers are the ones who are telling me to use AI for every task, but I don't want to use it. So that's something I've noticed. Maybe there's in some ways, if we haven't grown up in this very online world, maybe we're not used to the ideas of privacy and security, whereas younger people maybe they can be if they've had the opportunity to reflect already. They could be a bit more aware of those things. Sometimes it's the parents that I see out and about who are looking at their phones whilst their young children are around them. And so I guess it's no wonder that maybe later on, when the teenagers are looking at their phones, their parents suddenly don't want them to. But I guess the question is, how often do we have our phones out around our children or young people too? So I think yeah, sometimes the narrative can be, oh, it's the young people, they're the problem. But I do see there's just as prevalent use of technology in older people as well. It's just different. And so that can make intergenerational conversations difficult as well. And I know you're interested in how we can relate to each other, but I think yeah, it's already starting off in a difficult position.
I want to swing back to some of your earlier comments about formation, the rituals attached to it, the habits, how you begin the day, you end the day by opening your TikTok, and how over time these repeated actions they become habits, and given
Mhm.
their sacredness, like we kind of freak out when we don't have our habit in place that indicates something of tremendous value to us, almost a sacred value, they become rituals. So but there is a pro and a con here. There are rituals and routines like doom scrolling that can lead to despair, distraction that can lead to indifference. Do you have further comments about digital rituals shaping our emotional and spiritual lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way that you can think about it is the impact on attention. So these platforms, a lot of them, they just want our attention. They want us to keep engaging with the platforms. So how does that prolonged use affect how we attend and what or who we attend to? I guess that's the question that we can ask. And I feel like the general pattern is turning back the attention to the individual and to whatever is standard, whatever that might be. So individualization, standardization. Importantly, different from personalization, which is the marketing term, but I'm kind of drawing from some education research, especially from Mark Pegram, who criticizes this idea of personalization. It's a bit of a myth, it's a selling point, but actually what we get is not better engagement with the person, but sort of narrowing down to individual standardized collections of data points. I find that helpful. So the thing with this kind of data collection model is they test how we're best driven to attend to tech platforms, and it turns out that feelings like anger, fear, despair, frustration actually work really well to keep us hooked. It's actually these powerful negative emotions which work so well to keep us engaging. And so there's there's this kind of emotional shaping. And importantly, even when we feel like we're engaging with something true about the world, for example, this is again how I think it kind of works against our usual models of formation. Usually, when we think we're finding things out, we're finding the truth, we're attending to something in the world, that seems to be a good thing. But as with things like doom scrolling, where you just look through endlessly updating bad news, the question is this really engaging with others? Is it really encountering people? Or is it just more in line with this drive towards the individual and the standard? And so I feel like what we need to think about is these kind of routines that we get. So think throughout the day, what are we using our technology for? do we have these habits of doom scrolling, of arguing with trolls, or just looking at distressing things, which all might be true, and you might feel like people are saying wrong things, you want to respond to them. There might be good things in that, but I want to encourage a thoughtful reflection, prayerful reflection, even on the rituals that we have and the emotions that come along with them, because that can be a kind of signifier of whether we really are attending to people and what these technologies are really shaping us in. Like a simple example, I think, like, is there a difference between doom scrolling over some news, terrible news, and praying over that news with a friend? I think when we think about those two contexts, we immediately know that there's probably some difference in how we approach the same situation. And so we can think of a Christian framework for approaching even true things that are bad, how to deal with anxiety. The commands are to pray, to ask, to rejoice and not be anxious. And so, yeah, I think we should think about how technology shapes us in that way.
So, some people respond to AI and digital life with excitement, others with suspicion. How do you land on techno optimism and techno pessimism?
Yeah, I I think sometimes the way it's presented is almost like a false choice. So I think sometimes either we have to be pessimistic or optimistic. It kind of goes along with the default model. So what do I mean by that? I think the one choice is mitigating or banning technology because we think it's so problematic. But I worry with this that it can lead to further tensions because are already gaps in terms of access, and it kind of ignores what I was trying to bring up just now, that there are uses for technology for the most vulnerable in terms of assistive technology, emergency technology, which are important. And so sometimes there's this dynamic of the most privileged saying, oh, we should just not use technology, whilst at the same time, maybe running outreach programs and forcing underprivileged people to use technology. And so that's something that I feel like is going on with with talking about just banning it or mitigating it. It's only for some, and not really attending to people's needs. Whereas the other way, this optimism that we need to keep up, we need to embrace or harness the power of technology. I think that too has its problems. Mostly that there are even some really good ideas, some good approaches. So, for example, in the classroom, thinking about design justice and using AI to counter the problems of AI, like language revitalization projects and things like that. All good things, but I think they still go along with the default, which is this model of abundant resources. The best thing is more technology and more engagement with technology. And so underneath this as well, I think there's a kind of emphasis on the individual. So either we mitigate technology or we harness technology, and it's a matter of individual decision, or the individual gaining some sort of skills, and it's an individual responsibility issue. But I think it's important to place use or and especially non-use of technology in this broader ecosystem. Think about power, and that might mean the solutions have to be more about how groups interact. So rather than being a techno optimist or a techno pessimist, which either says we keep up or we have to catch people out using it, I think we need to think more about how we together address technology and challenge the default. So it's not about avoiding it or embracing it as it is, but trying to think about what it should be and bringing that about in our different communities.
now I want to talk about something like communal discernment, especially within Asian American families, Asian families, and Asian churches. If we move beyond simply embracing or banning technology, what does communal discernment look like? How might churches or families practice that?
I mean, this is a huge question. I feel like I myself am only starting to think about it as well. If we accept this diagnosis that there's all these pressures, individualizing, standardizing pressures that keep us just hooked and often in very negative ways. What can we do about it? And how can we address it in a way which takes seriously that ecosystem, that doesn't place more burdens on the vulnerable to be the ones responsible, and yet takes people's positions seriously? And I think maybe two things that we can think about. First, I think there's still work to do to develop moral imagination. So if the problem is the default model, what we need is a moral vision of what community well-being supported by technology looks like. What does it look like to support technology use for access for the most vulnerable, rather than removal of vulnerability through profiling, ranking, Instagram filters, and so on? One idea that I really am interested in is technology within limits. So this is an idea that researcher of education Neil Selwyn talks about. So it's in the context of education, but he issues this challenge to educators to challenge this model of abundant technology where we just use more and more and assume it will always be the case as more. And he challenges educators to think, what could a technology within limits model look like instead? And I find that helpful because I think I want to always acknowledge there is necessary use, but we need to set that in context. And what really is necessary use? Where is technology needed? Where are the needs? So instead of this one person with many devices model, could there be like a many to one model, a giving towards emergency assistive technologies? And this isn't in theological terms, but I just think that there's so many rich resources for this kind of development of what use of technology could look like. I've previously thought about the idea of dispossession, setting people free, this attitude towards technologies, especially maybe for those in positions of power, how we use technology or make others use technology to have this kind of mindset rather than control or trying to get everyone to be the same rather than exploiting. And so I think this task of moral imagination is really important. And I would love to see that happening regularly in the local church. So when I actually hear technology brought up a lot in sermons and in talks or focused workshops, but often the takeaway is just use it less, don't be so sucked into it, which is true, but I feel like the really powerful stuff is offering a different vision. You know, what what is, yeah, what's our community for, and how can we support well-being? And technology has its place in that, but it just has to look very different. And in terms of how that's then, if that's like the big picture, developing moral imagination, which, yeah, it doesn't have to be directly talking about technology all the time. I hope that that's what's happening in churches anyway. In terms of how that looks like in the local church, yeah, I think I like to think about it in terms of putting structures in place that support people. So first of all, I really like this framing that you've provided for us here of thinking about it in terms of anxiety and fear, because that gives us room to think about mental health. And that's not always the approach. As I said, often it's we're not doing well enough, we need to do better with technology. But I think mental health, it's so impacted by technology. And then it gives us space to talk about healing and reconciliation from genuine harms. that happen to young people, especially in the digital world. They are vulnerable and exploited, I think, in so many ways. There's so much harmful content, especially for young girls. Yeah, I think this framing is so helpful and so important, and I hope the church can make use of that. Then I think, yeah, it's going to require staff and resources and real attention by church leaders to think about how to challenge the default technology, help people repent, heal from the default. And there's a lot of discussions, especially about use of technology in the church. So we've talked a lot about daily life, but I think use of technology in the church could be a really good place to start. So really thoughtful use of technology, which goes beyond just the idea that now the pandemic is over, we need to just be in person and technology has done all these harms. I think there's still lessons to learn about how those who are sick or find on in-person meetings overstimulating or have really made use of these kind of text-to-speech or speech-to-text technologies were able to come into the church when it went online. These kinds of groups of vulnerable people, I think there's still lessons to learn about the use of technology for them in the church. So that's also something that if we want people to be using technology well in their daily lives, I hope leaders can think how to model technology use in the church setting for the most vulnerable. And even as we think about moving into the space of content creation, because I guess we want to be there in the digital world if young people are there all the time as well, how do we do that without buying into the likes and shares and attention grabbing algorithms? I've been to talks which talk about maximizing your shares and for evangelistic purposes, and it makes me a little bit uneasy. Oh, not just a little bit.
That's a really wise, sober, prospective looking, concluding comment. Throughout this conversation, Rachel, I've learned so much, and it's clear your research and teaching on digital tech and ethics, as well as your Christian commitments, come through with such rigor and substance. I just want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on these wide-ranging questions. To kind of throw it back to you for the last word, if you could offer a word of encouragement or perhaps challenge to our Asian and Asian American faith leaders about technology and spiritual formation, what would that be?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. I feel like my thoughts are just coming together in this context. So thank you for offering this space to me. Yeah, I previously wrote this reflection on Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. And I felt like maybe this would be a good place to end because it's with Jesus and his ministry. So opening of Hebrews, it just starts with this huge picture of Jesus's ministry from creating and sustaining worlds to suffering and dying on the cross and then being raised to sit down in the heights of majesty. But in all of this, the powerful thing is that Jesus embodies God's glory. So he shows us who God is, and importantly, deeply embodied and participatory in creation. So he's not distant, he's not uncaring. He gives himself up to make his people clean. And I feel like as we've talked about this default of technology, one thing that we've seen is that we can end up ignoring and demeaning this pattern that Jesus shows us. We can not act, we can reinforce harmful behaviors, we can avoid this deep participation. And so I hope that we can be prayerful about committing to practices which are true to this pattern, to make room to see technology in light of God's past and future faithfulness. So, and particularly to make room for others to see that too, to engage more deeply with God and with each other and the creation around us. So I suppose my prayer, which I ended that reflection with is, Father, may Christ's embodied revelation startle us and orient our use of technology for your glory. So that's where I'd like to end.
That is an awesome word, a fitting prayer. And I pray for all of our listeners that the Spirit would give us discernment in our families, in our churches, in our schools and workplaces as we all grapple with these opportunities, these affordances that digital tech and social media offer. Thank you, Rachel, so much for this podcast.
Thank you.